All right, buckle up, everybody. We're going deep today, like really deep. We're diving into a single source, an audio clip, and the title. Oh boy, it's a doozy. 1,400 shocking years of Islam in 5 minutes. Muslims are scared of this.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely going to grab your attention. I mean, who
Yeah.
wouldn't want to know what's so shocking that, people would be scared of it?
It definitely sets a certain tone, but look, we're not here to say whether we agree or disagree with this perspective. What we are going to do is explore it, see what it's all about.
So the speaker jumps right in, rapid fire style. They're saying that basically violence and expansionism, subjugating non-Muslims, that this has been like the defining characteristic of Islam from like the very beginning.
So they're setting up this kind of historical narrative, right, to explain how they see like modern events. They're connecting it to things like the rise of ISIS and stuff like that. Like it's this pattern, repeating itself throughout history. And they start with the very origins of Islam. So they're claiming that after Muhammad couldn't convert the Jews in Medina, he went from being like a spiritual leader to a military one. And that, they say, was the turning point. That's when Islam became this political force.
Okay, so this raises a really interesting question, right? Like, how do we interpret these events? Is this a neutral telling of what happened? Or is there something else going on here, like an agenda or something? We always got to think about who's telling the story and why?
Absolutely. It's all about perspective. And speaking of different perspectives, the speaker then shifts to how non Muslims were treated under Islamic rule. They bring up this concept of dhimmi, which was basically the status of Jews and Christians living under Islamic authority. They were allowed to live there, but they had to deal with some restrictions.
Yeah, like they had to pay this special tax, the jizya. And there were limits on their religious practices. They even had to wear like specific clothes, to set them apart. And this is where the speaker makes a pretty, some might say, controversial claim. They connect this historical practice to the yellow star, the one used to identify Jews in Nazi Germany.
They're saying it was actually an Islamic invention from like ninth century Iraq. That's a pretty bold statement, linking these two historical moments.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely designed to get your attention. And it makes you wonder, why is the speaker drawing this parallel? What are they trying to say about Islam, about its history?
Okay, so then from there, they jump to the Crusades. They're presenting them as a Christian response to like centuries of Muslim aggression, saying it was basically a defensive action, to liberate Jerusalem and protect Christians in the Holy Land.
So they're implying that the Crusades were justified, right? A reaction to Islamic expansionism. But we have to remember the Crusades were incredibly complex. I mean, it wasn't just good versus evil or anything like that. There were political reasons, economic factors, even conflicts within Christianity and Islam themselves.
Right, it's way more nuanced than just like a clash of civilizations.
Right?
But building on that idea, clashing the civilizations, the speaker describes how vast the Islamic Empire was at its peak, stretching from Spain all the way to China.
Oh, but then according to the speaker, it all started to fall apart because of the European Industrial Revolution. They say this is what allowed European powers to build these strong armies and push back against Islamic expansion. So in their view, it's Europe that's at the center of the story, right?
Yeah.
European technology is the reason for the decline of the Islamic Empire.
It's all about the shift in power to Europe.
Yeah, pretty much. And while European colonialism definitely played a role, this interpretation kind of ignores a lot of other stuff, things that were happening within the Islamic world, their interactions with other global powers. All of that contributed too, right?
Okay, so we've got this sweeping historical arc, but then all of a sudden, they jump to 1924. And they mark this year as the end of the Islamic Caliphate. It's when Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the Turkish leader, abolished it. He was a secularist, so he also did things like, give women rights and ban traditional Islamic clothes.
And the speaker claims that Muslims like universally hated Ataturk for all of this. They even call him a Jewish agent, which, is a pretty loaded statement. It makes it seem like all Muslims felt the same way, which
Okay.
wasn't necessarily true, right? Ataturk is still a controversial figure in Turkey. People have a lot of different opinions about him.
So, in the speaker's view, the Islamic Caliphate, after 1,400 years, just ends. Boom. But they don't stop there. They go on to argue that two major things in the 20th century led to like a resurgence of Islam.
They point to the discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia, which brought a lot of wealth and influence to the region. And then there's the 1979 Iranian Revolution, led by Ayatollah Khomeini. The speaker says this was a model for Islamic revivalism.
And this is where their argument takes a more pointed turn. They focus on two Islamic principles of war: taqiyya, which is the idea of permissible lying to advance Islam, and the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. They present this treaty as an example of like strategic deception used by Muhammad to defeat his enemies.
Right. So just to clarify for our listeners, takia is a complex concept. It's often misunderstood and misrepresented, frankly. You really need to understand the historical context and the different interpretations within Islamic law to talk about it accurately. But the speaker uses these concepts to make comparisons to things happening today. They're saying that agreements with, let's say, Iran are basically meaningless because of these principles.
So are they saying we should basically distrust any kind of diplomacy or negotiation with Muslim majority countries?
Well, yeah, that seems to be what they're getting at. It's a pretty cynical view of international relations, you know, and it relies on this generalization about like the motivations of entire groups of people.
So they're painting this picture of like a resurgent Islam, fueled by oil money and this like willingness to deceive. At least that's what the speaker's saying. But it doesn't end there. They go on to present what they see as like proof that this dangerous ideology is like super widespread.
Right, and that's where they bring up this Pew Research poll from 2013. They claim it shows that most Muslims, even the ones who are considered, moderate, actually agree with the goals of groups like ISIS, which is a pretty big claim.
Yeah, they highlight the statistic that 77% of Muslims in like key Islamic nations, Indonesia, Pakistan, Egypt, Nigeria, Bangladesh, they supposedly support both Sharia law and an Islamic caliphate. I mean, on the surface, that sounds kind of scary, right? Like this ideology they've been talking about, it's got tons of support.
Well, yeah, if you just look at the numbers, yeah, it sounds pretty alarming. But we got to remember, polls can be kind of tricky. You have to be careful about how you interpret them. And in this case, the speaker kind of leaves out some important context.
Okay, so let's like break down this poll a little bit. First of all, what were people actually asked? Was it just a straightforward question like, do you support Sharia law?
Not exactly, no. The way they worded the questions could have influenced how people answered. For example, the question about Sharia law. It didn't say which aspects of Sharia law people supported. It's kind of like asking, do you support the law in general? Most people would probably say yes, right? Thinking of basic rules like, the stuff that keeps society running.
Yeah, but the law, I mean, that covers a huge range of things. You might not agree with everything.
Exactly. And Sharia law is similar. It's this whole spectrum of things from like family law and inheritance to, criminal justice. So it's totally possible that a lot of the people who took the poll, they supported some parts of Sharia that aren't like inherently extremist. Maybe they were thinking about rules for marriage or divorce,
Mm.
not the harsh punishments that some people associate with a strict interpretation of Sharia.
So someone could say they support Sharia, but they don't necessarily agree with the kind of like hardline ideology the speaker's talking about.
Exactly. And it's the same with the question about the Islamic Caliphate. The poll didn't make a distinction between like a historical caliphate, something from the past, and a modern day one, like, what ISIS declared. Some people might have been expressing a kind of nostalgia,
Right.
like longing for a past era. They weren't necessarily saying they support ISIS.
It's like saying you support the idea of like a king, but that doesn't mean you want to overthrow the government and install a monarchy, right?
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. So the speaker is presenting this poll as like clear evidence of widespread support for extremism, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. They're basically taking complex data and oversimplifying it to fit their narrative.
Classic case of cherry picking, it sounds like.
You got it. And as critical thinkers, we got to be able to recognize these tactics. Data can be powerful, but it can also be really easily manipulated. Always look for the full context and be careful of anyone who gives you like a simple answer to a really complex question.
Right. Okay, so we've like dissected this poll and seen its limitations. But the speaker doesn't stop there. They finish with this call to action, emphasizing the, urgent threat of radical Islam. They say we need leaders who understand this historical context, this ideology.
And here's where their language gets really intense. They're playing on people's fears, implying that we're on the verge of this like clash of civilizations. This kind of talk can have real world consequences.
Meaning it could actually affect how people think about Muslims and Islam, right? And how they act towards them.
Absolutely. It can lead to prejudice, discrimination, even support for like aggressive foreign policies. We got to recognize that this kind of framing is often used to justify actions that might otherwise seem, extreme or harmful.
And it's all based on this very specific and honestly kind of questionable interpretation of history that we've been talking about.
Exactly. They want you to see Islam as this, like, one big thing,
Right.
driven by this single ideology that's inherently dangerous.
But like we've been saying, that's just not accurate.
Not at all. It ignores all the diversity within Islam. It's like looking at Christianity and saying everyone who calls themselves Christian believes the same things and supports the same actions, which is obviously not true. You've got different denominations, different interpretations of the Bible, different levels of like commitment to religious teachings. Islam is just as diverse, and it's really misleading to portray it as this, homogenous, threatening force.
So this whole narrative is built on the idea that Islam equals Islamism, right? Which isn't true at all.
Exactly. We got to make a distinction between Islam as a faith and Islamism as a political ideology. Islamism is a specific movement, one that wants to establish Islamic law and governance. But not all Muslims are Islamists, just like not all Christians want to live in a theocracy.
Okay, so we've really gotten deep into this speaker's perspective, analyzing their claims, the evidence they use, and how they use language to persuade people. But, like, why does any of this matter to our listener? Why should they care about one person's interpretation of history?
That's the question, right? Why should you, the listener, care about this? Well, this audio clip, it might seem like just one voice, but it reflects this bigger conversation that's happening in our society. A conversation about Islam, about terrorism, about the West's relationship with the Muslim world.
And like we've seen, this conversation is often filled with, misinformation, fear-mongering, and dangerous oversimplifications.
For sure. And this specific audio clip, it's just one example of how history can be used to push certain agendas. It's a reminder that we all need to be critical thinkers, especially when it comes to something as complex and sensitive as, religion and history.
So what should our listener take away from this deep dive so far? What are the key points to remember?
Well, the most important thing is to remember that history is complicated. There's never just one definitive interpretation of the past. Be suspicious of any narrative that claims to have the absolute truth, especially when it comes to something as vast and diverse as Islamic history.
And we've seen how easy it is to twist evidence or take it out of context, right? To support a particular point of view.
Absolutely. So always be critical of the evidence that's being presented. Don't just accept claims at face value. Look for sources. Look for other evidence that supports or contradicts the claim, and try to find alternative interpretations. Ask yourself, who's giving me this information and why? What are their motivations?
And like we talked about, pay attention to how they're saying it.
Yeah.
Their tone of voice, the words they use. Are they trying to make you feel a certain way? Are they using loaded language or making generalizations? Those can be signs that they're trying to manipulate your perspective.
And finally, remember that Islam is a diverse religion. It's got a rich and complex history. It's not just one thing, and Muslims have a wide range of beliefs and practices. Don't fall into the trap of stereotyping a whole group of people based on the actions or beliefs of a few.
We've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive, but we're not quite done yet. In our last part, we're going to switch gears and look at some different perspectives on Islamic history. We'll point you to some resources where you can learn more, and we'll leave you with some questions to think about as you continue your own exploration of this fascinating topic. All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive. And man, we've spent the last two parts really digging into this one take on Islamic history. It's been a lot, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been pretty intense for sure. We've been on this like whirlwind tour through this very specific perspective. Remember, the speaker's main argument is that Islam, like throughout history, has been all about violence and expansion, and that this is still a threat today. We've looked closely at what they're saying, the evidence or sometimes lack of evidence, and how they kind of cherry pick and oversimplify things to fit their narrative.
We've definitely done some unpacking, that's for sure. But like we've been saying, we're not here to tell you what to think. We want to give you the tools to think for yourself. So we've spent all this time with this one perspective, but now it's time to, zoom out a bit.
Right. It's important to remember that history is always told from a certain point of view. No single story can ever capture everything, you know, especially when we're talking about something as massive and complex as Islamic history.
So if this audio clip is just one piece of the puzzle, where can our listeners go to find other pieces? Where can they get a more, well-rounded and balanced view of Islamic history?
Oh, there's so many great resources out there. You could start by checking out what universities have to offer, like Georgetown University has this Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and Harvard has a Center for Middle Eastern Studies. They have courses, publications, research, all sorts of stuff that explores Islamic history from different angles.
That sounds great if you're ready for some serious academic work, but are there options for someone who wants something a little more, approachable?
Oh, absolutely. There are tons of great podcasts out there that cover history in a really engaging way. You can also find documentaries, even historical fiction novels that can give you a much richer understanding of Islamic history and culture.
It's like having different tour guides, right? Each one with their own expertise and perspective, leading you through this incredible landscape.
Exactly. And just like you wouldn't rely on just one tour guide to show you everything a city has to offer, you shouldn't rely on just one source for your understanding of history.
The key is to be curious, keep an open mind, and seek out diverse voices and interpretations. Okay, so we've talked about these resources, but why does this even matter? Why should our listener, sitting here in 2025, care about debates over Islamic history?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? It might seem like, ancient history, something that happened a long time ago, far removed from our lives. But the way we understand the past, it really does shape how we see the world today. If you accept this narrative that portrays Islam as inherently violent and expansionist, well, that can lead to prejudice, discrimination, even support for policies that harm Muslims.
So it's not just about abstract historical debates. It can actually affect how we interact with people, how we see the world, even how we vote.
Exactly. And it's so important to remember that the vast majority of Muslims around the world, they condemn violence and extremism,
Yeah.
painting an entire religion with one brushstroke, saying that like over a billion people all share the same dangerous ideology. It's not only inaccurate, but incredibly dangerous.
We've seen throughout this deep dive how this kind of like black and white thinking, this us versus them mentality, can be used to justify all sorts of harmful things.
It's a reminder that we need to constantly question the stories we're told. We need to seek out diverse perspectives and engage in respectful dialogue, even when it's difficult.
Well said. We're almost out of time for this deep dive, but I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've talked a lot about how history can be misused, how it can be twisted to serve certain agendas, but it can also be a really powerful force for good.
Right. It can help us understand each other, build empathy, build bridges between cultures. When we approach history with curiosity and an open mind, we can challenge our own assumptions, see things from different angles, and hopefully contribute to a more informed and compassionate world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. We hope this has been a thought provoking and insightful journey for you, our listeners. But remember, this is just the beginning of your own exploration. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the world of ideas.